that at this particular stage, when states have become so powerful that they can intrude on your lives with the kind of digital surveillance that they have at their command, it is very, very important for citizens to protect themselves with this kind of buffer of rights.
Hello friends, my name is Abhay Kumar, and today we are going to talk about the issue of human rights, and we will try to learn from Professor Amir Ali from Jawaharlal Nehru University that how the idea of human rights has evolved in intellectual history. Today is December 10th, on the very day the United Nations General Assembly adopted Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and Human Rights Day is celebrated on December 10th to mark that occasion. Professor Amir Ali teaches political science at JNU, and his PhD work is also very much related to the concept of rights. So he will be the best person to speak today. So sir, thank you very much for joining.
Thank you, Abhay.
So the first questions I am asking, that today is Human Rights Day, and many people would be interested to know that how the idea of human rights has evolved in political philosophy. What do you mean by the fact that all human beings are born equal? Could you give us definition, and also could you trace the intellectual history of human rights?
It's an important question that you just asked, and I think the philosophy and history of human rights it's a long one, but it's one that is worth tracing, especially in the very fraught times that we live in right now, because if anything, the significance and relevance of human rights can be understood in the way that there are vehement denunciations of human rights by people who, of course, are made uncomfortable by the very concept of human rights. I mean, one can go back to the late 18th century, the events around the American Revolution from 1776 onwards, where the ideas of these rights being self-evident, that all men are born equal, it arises. It's reinforced in 1789 when you have the French Revolution. And even though these are events that are happening far away from India, I think it's very, very important for these ideas to be imbibed, because the notion of rights, I think, is one of the most powerful ways in which individuals can protect themselves from very, very powerful entities, most notably the state. Now, the idea of human rights, of course, gets amplified in 1948, as you were mentioning, Abhay, with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But if there are important landmarks, these three would be the most important landmarks in terms of historical developments that foreground and put at the center stage why a conception of human rights is so important. Philosophically, there are critiques of human rights. So, for example, there are famous philosophers. One I can think of is Edmund Burke, who denounces the notion of natural rights. He feels that such rights do not exist. There's no such thing as a natural right. So he makes this point in his book, Reflections on the Revolution in France, which came out a year after the French Revolution. A philosopher like Jeremy Bentham, for example, denounces natural rights as nonsense upon stilts. There's a critique of rights in Marx in his famous essay in 1843 on the Jewish question. But the point that I want to make is that there are certain historical landmarks and there are certain philosophical critiques. It's important to look at those landmarks, it's important to look at those critiques, and then to understand the way in which a conception of rights that is valid, that is viable, that is feasible for the 21st century is forged, and we move ahead. I would also like to point out that this idea that people often put forward of rights being a Western conception is something that I would not accept at all. I would stress this point, that at this particular stage, when states have become so powerful that they can intrude on your lives with the kind of digital surveillance that they have at their command, it is very, very important for citizens to protect themselves with this kind of buffer of rights. The denunciation of rights, they may be well-meaning, but they tend to kind of feed into this instinct of dismissing human rights altogether. And this is done by powerful entities, states, that are not interested in protecting the rights of their citizens. And therefore, again, I would stress this point on this very important day, that if individuals are to be protected from the depredations of the state, it's important for rights to act as a buffer, as a bulwark against the encroaching advance of states that will take away the rights of individuals.
Many students who are studying human rights, those who are in law, sometimes they struggle to understand what is human rights. And as you have pointed out, that the very fact that human rights are based on Western ideas are not truly correct. So could you just trace it in some detail how the ideas are developed? And in 1948, on 10th of December, when the United Nations General Assembly, when it is adopting Universal Declaration of Human Rights, who are the philosophers, which are the ideas, which are the social movements, which are influencing those decisions to be made?
So let me try to define human rights, and it's always a challenge to define anything. And one of the best ways of defining something is to, kind of suggest what the entity is not. So let me again stress that there's this attempt these days to link rights to duties, and I do not think that any conditionality could be put on rights. Rights are absolute guarantees of the interest and of individuals. So I would not want to link rights with duties as many political tendencies tend to do these days. The idea that you can only have rights if you've done your duties, I think that's a very, very dangerous kind of an idea. A right is an entitlement, it is a protection, it is meant to bring about a certain empowerment. So in a nutshell, if one were to define a right, it is a kind of a protective bulwark of the individual. It is meant to protect the individual from the onward advance of political tendencies that would want to undermine the centrality and the significance of the individual. It is also meant to translate into empowerment. Now, quite often rights don't translate into empowerment, and when that happens, the right is a mere kind of a paper presence, as we say. That it's important for that not to happen. So in terms of the definition, there are 3 points that I would want to kind of stress and underline. Firstly, rights must not be linked to the conditionality of duties. I would make that point with as much emphasis as I can put on this. Secondly, rights are meant for the protection of individuals. They act as a bulwark to protect and buffer the individual from, especially states that tend to undermine the interests of the individual, that tend to take away or detract from the freedom of the individual. And thirdly, rights must translate into empowerment.
Before coming to you, I was again reading a Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the small document. And in that document, some terms, very powerful concepts, if I would like to say: reason, conscience, rights, dignity, right to privacy, justice, brotherhood, freedom, equality, right to life, liberty, security of individual, not a state, security of individual, and then right to peaceful assemblies, right to work even, right to nationality. These are given, and these are the ideals towards which I think the human society should move towards. But given the conditions today, or the situation which is emerging, we have seen that we have not achieved much. And if I say that the situation is becoming very critical, given the fact that there has been right-wing authoritarian regime emerging in several parts of world. So how would you look at these situations? What is your reaction as a political philosopher, as a thinker, as a public intellectual?
Okay, well, it's a matter of extreme concern, the fact that rights are not taken seriously. And I'm using the title of a work by Ronald Dworkin, a very famous American political philosopher, whose work is called Taking Rights Seriously, and to kind of borrow from that title and to twist it a little bit. I think the fact that we have a political culture in which rights are not taken seriously is a matter of great concern, because what that does is that it tends to foreground the interest of the state over the individual. Back in the late 1970s, there's a political theorist I would read a lot, Vernon van Dijk, who talked about a two-level theory of rights. And basically the point that Vernon van Dijk would make would be that you have rights at the level of the state and you have rights at the level of the individual. I think what has happened is that the states have, in their authoritarian manner, tended to undermine the rights of individuals, and quite often this is done in the interest of the state, reasons of state, raison d'etat, as we say. This is especially dangerous because a state exists because of its citizens, because of its individuals, and if a state cannot guarantee rights to its individuals of various kinds, there is no point for the state to exist at all. I mean, a state does not exist without its citizens. So the problem with the political culture that we have fostered is a lack of respect for rights, an inability to understand that rights belong to every single individual, irrespective of who that person may be, irrespective of religious background, of sex, of caste, or any other background that one can think of. The dignity of the individual that you talked about is very, very significant, because if rights do one thing, they guarantee, they protect, they seek to enhance the dignity of the individual. And what we notice today across the world is that, I mean, to borrow from George Orwell, there are some people who are more equal than others. Now, it's actually the people who are more equal than others who are least concerned about rights. And it's, you know, the people who are most likely to be the target of abuse by the state, of the state's agencies. Those are the people for whom rights become very, very important. So in terms of mending the very flawed political culture that we have, it's very, very important to bring back a concern for rights. Let me also add that, and I say this with a great deal of concern, I often talk about the British theorist T.H. Marshall and his famous idea of citizenship. And he talks about 3 different strands of rights that are developed over 3 different centuries. So he says that in the 18th century you had the development of civil rights, then in the 19th century you had the development of political rights, and then in the 20th century you had the development of social rights, which are linked to the welfare state. What one notices is an undermining, an unraveling of all these 3. I mean, right now we are in this very critical situation where something as basic and fundamental as the principle of habeas corpus, presenting someone in a court of law, has become, you know, it's kind of ridden, you know, states tend to ride roughshod over something of so basic. Now, I make this point quite often. I think we are at a very critical political juncture when the political principles that we thought were established and irrevocable are now being threatened. One of those is the notion of civil rights, which we thought that the 18th century had taken care of that, and that, you know, most democracies around the world would be able to guarantee this basic right. So I mean, that is how dangerous a situation we are right now in. Something as central, something that we thought as settled as civil rights are now under threat from domineering states. Right now there's this summit on democracy that President Joe Biden is hosting. Not that I'm a fan of the idea of hosting a summit on democracy, but if anything, what that summit represents is how threatened an open democratic political culture is. For an open democratic political culture, you need a valid conception of rights, not paper rights as I call it, you know, the mere presence of rights. Rights that can translate into actual empowerment, into the meaningful upliftment and improvement of people's lives. Rights cannot just be written on pieces of paper in constitutions as fundamental rights. They actually need to be translated into real improvement in people's lives. Otherwise, if rights fail to be translated into empowerment, they become these ghost-like presences which will haunt the polity. And they will haunt the polity by reminding the polity that these rights were meant to be translated into empowerment. The fact that they haven't is a failure of that polity.
What is, in your opinion, the biggest threat to human rights today? Is it the rising inequality, the rich becoming more richer, the poor becoming more poorer, or the rise of right-wing authoritarianism?
Both those things go together, Abhay. I mean, I'm someone who's very concerned by the rise of right-wing authoritarian populism. And it's difficult to disentangle these two because they actually go together. I mean, right now we are in a phase of human history when the levels of inequality are very, very high, and it's no coincidence that it's happening around the same time that we have the rise of right-wing authoritarian populist governments. So yes, the presence and the rise of inequality and the fact that governments don't seem to want to do anything about this is certainly a threat, not just to the very presence of human rights, but to democracy itself. In addition to that, what right-wing authoritarian populism does is to foster an extremely Philistine political culture in which things like human rights tend to be dismissed with a sneer. The idea that such people don't need human rights are meant for humans. I mean, these are the kind of things that I get to read every once in a while. So my worry about inequality is that, of course, inequality will undermine democracy and perhaps lead to the eventual demise of democracy itself. But more importantly, what right-wing authoritarian populism is doing is fostering this very anti-intellectual, this very Philistine culture in which there is a sneering contempt at human rights. The idea that human rights can just be kind of done away with. People who are beholden to these ideas must understand that one of the reasons why they are contemptuous of human rights is because the existence of rights doesn't seem to in any way affect them. It's only a matter of time before they will start realizing the mistake, that the fact that human rights were derided will at some point come back and boomerang and hit them. And that's something that people need to worry about.
Sir, you have also done research on the questions of minorities and other weaker sections. There is a feeling that the questions of national security is deliberately being used as a pretext to deprive whatever little gains minority have achieved in any democracy.
Yeah.
So instead of talking about extending and giving substantive rights to minorities, what is happening that under the right-wing regime and also the opportunism of the so-called liberal parties also, the questions of national security or the fight against war on terrorism or curbing extremism among minority communities, these are being used as a legitimate ground, and liberals, several liberals intellectuals are also giving consent to such anti-people policies. And these policies are going against the very interest of the minority communities, also Dalits, also Adivasi. And it is not a coincidence that when it comes to public institutions, universities, judiciary, Dalits, Adivasi, Muslims are underrepresented. But when it comes to under trials, custodial killing, arrest, and also those who are jailed, they are overrepresented. So on this day, given our Indian situations, as a thinker, as an intellectual, what is the way out?
It's a difficult question to answer, Abhay. I mean, I don't have an answer to a question of what is the way out. We can only get our heads together and try to think of a way out. I mean, the thing about human beings is that they've often found themselves in extremely difficult situations. And at such extremely bleak moments, people have really kind of put their heads together and been able to think of a way out. So the only thing I can say is that there is a way out of the kind of current situation that we are in. And we just need to kind of collectively start thinking and thinking hard. The war on terror, I think, is the single most extreme example of how rights have been suppressed. The various legislations that have been passed that have undermined basic ideas of civil rights is, I think, the abiding legacy of the war on terror. It is perhaps one of the most, I would say, the most fraudulent things that has been done in the last 20 years. This idea that you can actually wage a war on terror, it's nowhere near achieving any form of success. What it has done is it has stigmatized certain populations. It has kind of reinforced in people's mind that only some people are terrorists. So the point that I would want to make is that the abiding legacy of the war on terror will remain the way in which it has undermined notions of rights, centrally human rights, the rights of minorities, and for what? There has been no significant lowering or reduction of the threat of terrorism. In fact, I often feel that the politics behind the war on terror was to prevent people from realizing that perhaps this was not the real threat that people were facing. Climate change would be an even more fundamental existential threat, as we call it. And the political tendencies which are most enthusiastic about waging a war on terrorism are the ones that will really have no worry about the environment. President Trump, the former president of the US, Donald Trump, would be an example of this. So, I mean, what I am very worried about is the way in which societies, nations, polities have been lured into believing that the war on terror has done any good. It hasn't. There has been no perceptible reduction in the terror threat. Worse, what it has done is it has led to a frayed political culture in which democracy is now threatened. People have, as I said a little while ago, started looking at rights with what I can only call a sneering contempt. In terms of a way out, it's very important to bring back a certain kind of sensibility and a sensitivity in the polity. A sensitivity that can respect the most vulnerable. What I'm very worried about right now is the way in which states are targeting their most vulnerable. So there was a report on yesterday about Xinjiang province in China and the kind of genocidal terror, the kind of wave of genocidal violence that has been unleashed on the Uyghur population. This is why you need human rights, to prevent a state from launching these extremely dangerous attacks on its most vulnerable. The only way to protect the most vulnerable is by creating an international legal architecture. An international legal architecture that can underline and reinforce the centrality of human rights. And I think right now that really is the way out in terms of improving the very bad situation that we are in.
Sir, during our MA days in JNU also, we were given several readings: liberal conception of rights, Marxist conceptions of rights, feminist conception, and some articles were also given which argue that human rights could be traced and located in Eastern religion also. You have taught the paper related to rights for so many years. Which political philosophy is more promising to them, or can there be any synthesis among them? Could you just elaborate on this point?
Well, I mean, liberal philosophy is the philosophical stream that has said the most about rights. I mean, it's talked about rights most prolifically, but the problem with liberalism is that it's precisely in the prolific way in which it talks about rights that it tends to prevent rights from actually being translated into any form of serious empowerment. So the real problem with a liberal conception of rights is that it tends to talk about it so much, but then it ends up not being able to translate that into actual empowerment. Now, there is a Marxist critique of rights. I mean, as I mentioned the essay by Marx, the 1843 essay on the Jewish question, it is usually read as a critique of rights, and it has a very kind of a substantive critique. My problem with a lot of the left has been it hasn't really been able to take as seriously as it should have the universal nature of human rights. I think this is something which is very important, and as the left thinks about how to reforge and reinvent itself in the 21st century, it's very, very important to actually be able to understand how significant rights are. One or two other things I would like to add in terms of the question that you asked me rights are about the dignity of the individual. I mean, as you mentioned a while ago, I mean, if anything can protect the dignity of the individual, it is a system of robust rights. Now, it's important to ask the question, what prevents the dignity of the individual from being upheld? Now, one of the things is to actually talk about it too much. When you talk about something in a way that is not meaningful enough, what that ends up doing is undermining the very thing that you're talking about. So President Biden's summit, for example, which I am not very enthusiastic about, the problem with it is that this is precisely the way not to defend democracy. You can't defend democracy just by talking about it. And I think the problem with the liberal conception of rights has always been, it has talked about it so much, but has never really been able to translate that very talkative aspect of the philosophy into actual empowerment. For that to happen, it's important to kind of encompass and surround the conception of rights by the conditions that will enable the right to be translated into actual empowerment. On the question of rights and the most vulnerable, I think there's a kind of almost a rule of thumb that one can apply there. If I go back to your previous question, the point that you made about the minorities. Now, right now, minorities of various kinds across the world are extremely vulnerable. My advice to a lot of people would be to look at the most vulnerable in their societies as what we would call the canaries in the coal mine. Now, those of people who are not familiar with this idea is, I'll just explain this, is that when you go down into a coal mine, quite often miners will carry a small bird called a canary with them. Now, what the canary does is that when the levels of toxicity in the coal mine increase, the canary dies. Now, that is an indication that levels of toxicity are so high that going any further will be harmful for the miners. I think it's important to look at minorities in different countries as the canary in the coal mine. The fact that minorities are in such a vulnerable position indicates that the polity has achieved unmanageable levels of toxicity. If you think of what those famous words of George Floyd were before he died, "I can't breathe." That's what canaries would say if they could speak. "I can't breathe." This is the significance of rights, and especially rights for the vulnerable. the Adivasis, as you mentioned, the religious minorities of whichever country. Yesterday, day before yesterday in Pakistan, there was this report about a Sri Lankan individual who was killed because of accusations of blasphemy, and the blasphemy laws in Pakistan are extremely misused. So the point really is that you look at various societies across the world, there are some people who are the most vulnerable. For rights to translate into a real empowerment, they must be able to address the concerns of the most vulnerable. Otherwise, they will, as warning signals, be like the canaries in the coal mine. And people should start being beware, should be very, very careful, as we have really entered that very dangerous phase in which societies don't seem to kind of care or worry enough about their most vulnerable.
Thank you very much, sir, for talking to us.
Thank you, Abhay. It's always a pleasure talking to you.
Kindly like, share and subscribe our YouTube channel.